Pleasure to be with you today. So as Chris said, competitiveness is one of the themes we'll be talking about in this short presentation. We'll also be talking about connectivity, building on one of the themes that was a key element of Brian's presentation of the industry outlook. This gives a very short introduction to the narrative of this session. We know that aviation is a major enabler of economic activity and social cohesion. Really, we want to develop two toolkits that we've developed to assist our dialogue with governments, assisting governments to maximise the benefits of aviation for their countries and for prosperity in their home markets. Firstly, air connectivity, because as Brian already explained to you, it's air connectivity that delivers that generates the benefits, connecting cities, creating economic potential, and it's economic competitiveness of air transport that creates the preconditions for that air connectivity. We've already heard, you heard in Alexandre's remarks earlier in the previous session, that air transport supports, according to our latest estimates, 65.5 million jobs across the world and more than $2.7 trillion in GDP supported. Not just in the sector itself, also in tourism, by facilitating trade, by enabling attracting inward investment as well as creating the conditions for innovation and stimulating productivity. And as I said, it's air connectivity that does that. So let's start there. What do we mean by air connectivity? What are the factors that determine it? And it's a combination of a multiple set of factors. Depends on the number of flights, the number of seats, the number of destinations that serve, the number of airlines serving those markets. And we've developed a tool to bring those together, to encapsulate them, to measure them, to allow ourselves and governments to track performance and compare themselves. The first thing to say in terms of how we've done that is that not all destinations are equal. If you're sat here in Geneva, a connection to one of the world's major business centres or one of the world's aviation hubs has greater value. It creates more economic potential through doing business in that market, or it creates the potential of onward connections to one of the aviation hubs. So when we measure connectivity, we give those destinations higher weight because of their greater destination importance. So what do the results show us? Well, the first and the simplest way to look at connectivity is to look at it in its raw form, unweighted by any factors. And here you see the largest, unsurprisingly, you see the largest markets floating to the top: the US, China, Japan. What else can we see from this trend? Well, if you look at the trend of the last 5 years, we see that globally connectivity has increased by an average of between 30 and 35%, in line with the significant passenger growth that we've seen over that period. And we see relatively mature markets like the US and like UK and like Germany growing in line with that global average. But we see some markets, in particular India, growing much, much faster than that. And that talks, we heard from Brian in his presentation about the very, very rapid growth of the Indian domestic market over the past 5 years. So in terms of dialogue with governments, what does that leave for some of the smaller countries? They can't necessarily change their geography very easily. They can't get bigger, they can't grow their population overnight. What's the message for them in terms of connectivity and competitiveness? Another way of looking at connectivity is relative to country size. There are two ways you can do that. You can compare by weight by GDP, or you can weight by population. This slide shows what happens if you weight by GDP. You start to see a predominance of small island states, particularly tourism-dependent, inbound tourism-dependent economies coming to the fore. You see the likes of the Maldives and the Seychelles. Very small markets, very highly dependent on inbound aviation to support their tourism industries. If we were to look at it by population, and I put the slide on just to not overwhelm with bar charts in a relatively similar format. If we were to look at it by population, you'd see a different story again. Then you'd see some of the small-sized states that have really made aviation a central pillar of their economic strategy. You see the likes of Hong Kong and Singapore, you see the likes of Qatar and the UAE, you see the likes of Panama in the Americas. Countries very relatively small, but using geography to their advantage to become hubs connecting North and South America in the case of Panama, obviously east to west in the case of the Gulf, and connecting Asia in the case of Hong Kong and Singapore. Again, those countries that have captured and understood the benefits of aviation and made those work for their countries. What we've developed is a very versatile tool, and we can cut and slice and dice the data in a number of ways. We can compare intra-regional connectivity with extra-regional connectivity, for example. And if we did that, we'd highlight, particularly if we looked at regions like Africa and the Caribbean in particular, quite stark trends between relatively poor and declining intra-regional connectivity because of the fragmented nature of those markets, but much greater connectivity to the rest of the world. And the final way I'll show this, show our data, is in terms of cities. Again, linking back to Brian's presentation, Brian talked about the economic benefits of air transport being generated by connecting cities. And if we look at the top 20 connected cities, we show some quite interesting trends. The first of those is that London, in spite of the very well publicised capacity constraints in London, is significantly remains the world's most connected city in terms of air transport. And Laura will be talking after me about the role that the World Slot Guidelines have played in making sure that the airlines make best use of scarce capacity in Heathrow and increasingly in Gatwick as well. Also see that 10 of the top 20 most connected cities are already in Asia. And as we'll see shortly, we expect that trend to continue. So while 6 of them remain in the US, well, it's sort of historically the sort of center of gravity for the air transport industry, increasingly that's moving towards Asia. And a final comment is to say that connectivity, these top 20 cities, has grown by an average of 20% over the past 5 years. So continuing to grow lower than the global average trend. And in fact, only 2 cities of these 20 have grown faster than the global average. Those are Seoul and Guangzhou, which have grown by 42% and 34% in terms of their connectivity over the past 5 years, respectively. So that gets us quite a good understanding about connectivity. And as I said, we know that that's what generates the economic benefits. Now we move on to think about what governments should be doing, how we can help governments generate more connectivity for their countries. And we heard in the previous session, so it's helpful to have the slide here, that the economic centre of gravity of the air transport industry is moving ever eastwards. So let's pause for a moment on this to talk you through, because it was mentioned in the Q&A. I can explain a little bit what it means with the benefit of the graph here. You see, we start in 1914. We have the Solitary, that first commercial flight across Tampa Bay in Florida. By 2004, the centre of gravity of the industry was firmly in the North Atlantic. It's historical heartland, if you like. And what it means by centre of gravity is essentially that half of air traffic is to this side of it, and half of global air traffic is to the other side. So pretty much it's the dividing line, the meridian for the global air transport industry. If we look now, it's somewhere across the sort of pretty much in line with the Gulf. Here it is in 2016, moving ever eastwards, and by 2036, according to our latest forecasts, it'll be somewhere in South Asia. So half of air traffic will be basically to the east of that point. Asia will be dominant where 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was the North Atlantic. For the historic markets, maturing markets of North America and Europe, that creates a challenge. They need to run to stand still. They need to work ever harder to generate growth. Looking at our long-term demand forecast, we see over the next 20 years, 2% annual growth in Europe and 2.4% annual growth in North America. Much faster rates, of course, in Asia. And within the rapidly growing Asian economies, also competition to really make the most of those potential. And that's where our analysis of competitiveness comes in, really to facilitate our dialogue with the governments about what they should do to maximise the benefits of air transport. It's not a particularly new concept to say that there's a symbiotic relationship, a virtuous circle relationship between air transport and economic performance. I think it's fairly well established. What we've tried to do is really try and drill down and say, well, what is it about the makeup of your country that facilitates air connectivity? Now, clearly, some of the factors are out with the control of ministries of transport and civil aviation authorities, country size, geography, the size of the economy, and demographics. They're all really important drivers of air traffic demand that aren't easily controllable by the government of the day. But we've identified 5 factors that we think are of really crucial importance for determining air connectivity, and which ministries of transport and civil aviation authorities can exert influence over. The first of those is infrastructure. You've heard already from Alexander in his remarks that it's a key theme that IATA is doing an awful lot of work on. You'll be hearing a lot more about the work we've been doing on that from Hemant Mistry in his remarks. Clearly, there needs to be the right capacity, cost efficiently delivered, and managed in the right way. Where capacity is scarce, it needs to be managed in the right way. Again, you'll be hearing from Lara about the WSG. The next theme is cost competitiveness. And I mean cost competitiveness in terms of the inputs and the supply chain. It needs to be cost efficient and well regulated. We see the increasing burden of ticket taxes and also the increase in infrastructure costs that Brian highlighted in his presentation. So keeping a check on costs and remaining cost competitive is an important part of facilitating connectivity and ensuring value and choice for consumers. The next theme is the policy-making framework, good governance and smarter regulation. Aviation is a highly regulated industry, and for all that we've heard about safety and security, there are very, very good reasons for that. And IATA wants to be a willing partner of governments in terms of setting policy. To do that, there needs to be good channels for consultation, good channels for dialogue, and also policy making that's in line with, not with IATA principles, but with OECD better regulation principles, transparency, impact assessment, and so on and so forth. And so good governance and smarter regulation is a key pillar of a competitive air transport sector. And finally, another theme that we've heard an awful lot about already this morning, open borders in terms of facilitating the flow of passengers and cargo in and out of countries on airplanes. And essentially the logic of our toolkit and how the two of them join together is that a country that's got good conditions on those 4 or 5 key themes has created for itself the conditions for developing good air connectivity. So those are the principles of our toolkit. What are the kind of things that you can expect us to see? Well, again, it's a versatile toolkit that can be put together in a couple of ways. Firstly, we can look at the example of an individual country. And here we show the example of Spain. Chosen Spain because it has previous in terms of being rather good at these indices. It's obviously very dependent on tourism, and in terms of the World Economic Forum's Travel and Tourism Index, it comes out as number 1. So how does it fare in terms of air transport? Hopefully some of you will be sort of familiar with seeing this kind of format of graph, but just to explain it, each of the points of the pentagon refers to one of the pillars of our competitiveness toolkit. Each of them is measured on a 0 to 10 scale, and further out towards the perimeter means a higher score, means a better performance essentially. 10 is perfect, is global best practice, and 0 is really not so good. So how does Spain compare? Well, if we start with the infrastructure here, we've compared Spain in red with a peer group of 12 European economies in blue. And so where you see the Spanish point being further out towards the perimeter than the blue European comparator, that means that Spain has an area of strength here. And if we look at infrastructure, that's what we see. We know that, many of you will know that through the 2000s, Spain invested very heavily in its airport infrastructure, some would say too heavily, but it certainly doesn't seem that investing in large amounts of new airport capacity is one of Spain's priorities in terms of being more competitive as an air transport market. On the other hand, if we look here at our governance and smarter regulation pillar, we see that the Spanish point is inside the European average, closer to the centre. That means here's an area where Spain has potential to improve, and indeed that's what we see in practice. We see that the policy making is very bureaucratic. There are a number of burdensome regulations that the industry has to face. Limited scope for or difficult channels of dialogue between the industry and the government, and therefore less influence to shape and work and partner with government in setting regulatory framework than we would like, leading to those burdensome regulations. So there's an area where Spain could improve, and we could work together to help Spain improve to become more competitive. So that's one way in which we can use this tool to help governments and establish dialogue around policy making. And the other is to compare horizontally across a group of countries. And some of you will have spoken to Peter Serdar this morning about the Americas, so I'll use the example of Latin America here. And what we see is quite divergent performance. Sorry, press the wrong button there. On the left-hand side here, we have two countries in Chile and Panama that perform well compared to their regional peers. Chile doesn't have geography on its side. It's to the south, far south of South America. It's a long way from anywhere. And the government there understands that in order to generate connectivity, they have to really run hard, as it were, to stand still. And so one of the better examples, as it is in many areas of the economy, a good example for doing business. And indeed, the new administration of Piñera has acted already to work on a couple of the barriers to developing air connectivity, namely cutting some of the cost burden that the previous administration had introduced. And also you'll hear from Hemant about some of the work that IATA is doing with the Chilean government to help enhance and improve the concession for Santiago Airport there. So a country that's open for business, open for dialogue with industry. Similarly, Panama is a classic example. We've already talked about it in terms of connectivity, in terms of a country that overperforms for its country's size because it understands the power that aviation has to generate prosperity. On the other extreme, we have some of our more challenging markets, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Already, Alexander talked about the big infrastructure challenge in Mexico and the unfortunate decision by the new incoming president to cancel the airport that's already underway there. That's not going to solve what's a very severe infrastructure crisis in Mexico City. Colombia has real challenges across the board, but a particular challenge of cost competitiveness. If you buy an average ticket from Bogota to our regional headquarters in Miami, 50% or more of your ticket price will be made up of taxes and charges, obviously making that the cost of travel greater. And Brazil has real challenges in terms of policy making and bureaucracy. So that gives you sort of another cut of our data and how we can present this and how we can work with governments to show potential for improvement. But what does it all add up to? And here's where I sort of come back to the beginning about the benefits of aviation, because the policy and regulatory and operating environment does have an important impact in terms of the doing business environment. So if we take a look at our 20-year passenger forecast, we have 3 scenarios within there. We have a constant policy framework scenario, we have a reversal of globalization, an inhibiting policy environment scenario, and we have a favorable policy scenario where the preconditions for delivering air connectivity are put in place. And if you look at the numbers between those, that most pessimistic, cautious scenario and the most optimistic, the difference by the time we get out to 2037 is in excess of 4 billion passengers that could be lost to the industry, that could lose the opportunity of flying, could lose the potential to do business, to travel, to visit friends and family, if the policy preconditions are not put in place. So that's the consumer impact of policy frameworks of becoming more competitive or less competitive. Finally, to take that back to the macroeconomic impact of it, ability of air transport to generate economic benefits, to stimulate economic activity. Again, we see the same scenario. So the difference between the more pessimistic reverse globalization scenario and the maximum liberalization, the favorable policy scenario, is as much as 30 million jobs by 2037, and a difference in terms of economic GDP contribution of more than $3 trillion. But just to put that into context, 30 million jobs is 50% more, is about half of what today's jobs supported are, 65.5 million today. So a difference of 30 million is half of those jobs generated today in terms of context. And in terms of that $3 trillion of GDP, again, that's equivalent to today's GDP contribution of the industry. That could be won or lost depending on whether the preconditions for competitiveness are put in place. So this is something that matters, and it's why we stand ready to work with governments to support increasing competitiveness. So that's what I have by way of presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James.